Peter Schiff was right. That was the name of the YouTube video that has been viewed nearly 1.3 million times since the market mayhem last September. And that video is only one of many excerpts from Mr. Schiff. The view totals for Mr. Schiff on YouTube are therefore clearly higher, much higher than 1.3 million. So what has been the source of this massive public interest? For years, Peter Schiff has been appearing on radio and television, on CNBC, CNN, Fox News, Fox Business Network, Bloomberg, and many other networks. And in these appearances, he continually expresses a message critical of America's economy based on borrowing and spending rather than on saving and production. His message is equally critical of the political policies that led to that kind of economy. As you can see in the YouTube video, Schiff was often derided, dismissed, or ridiculed about these views, until his predictions started, one by one, to come true. Schiff, a licensed broker with more than 20 years of experience, is the head of Euro-Pacific Capital. Wiley & Sons published his best-selling book, Crash Proof: How to Profit from the Coming Economic Collapse, in 2007. His new book, which some of you have now, The Little Book of Bull Moves in Bear Markets, How to Keep Your Portfolio Up When the Market is Down, came out with the same publisher this past fall. The new book has pursued a similar course to the top of bestseller charts. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming a man with a penetrating and controversial message about the state of the world today, Peter Schiff.
This is the book, if you haven't seen it. Crash Proof. I'm actually in the process of revising the book now, and Crash Proof 2.0 is going to be coming out, I think, in October. But the change, we dropped the coming from the title. So instead of how to profit from the coming economic collapse, it's going to be how to profit from the economic collapse. Because it's obviously no longer coming, it's here. But, you know, the real thing is the economic collapse that I envisioned in this book is just getting started. I mean, it's not over. A lot of people think that this is it, that this is what I was predicting. This isn't what I was predicting. This is basically the start. The premise of this book was that we were living in a bubble economy. We had a phony economy that was based on spending borrowed money. We were borrowing money from the world because the world saved and we didn't, and then we used that borrowed money to buy products that they produced. We also used the money to build houses and remodel houses, and Wall Street used the money for all sorts of speculations. But the bottom line is we weren't being productive. We were living in an illusion. And as we spent money and we kept, counting that spending in our GDP, we deluded ourselves into thinking we had economic growth because an economist pointed to an expanding GDP. Meanwhile, we ignored the fact that that growth was increasingly comprised of spending money. And we ignored the fact that we were going into debt to spend that money. And no one seemed to care about all the liabilities that we were accumulating because they were blinded by real estate equity or stock market valuations. And people thought, well, the debt is manageable because look at all these assets. Well, the assets were an illusion. There wasn't any real value there. Our stocks were not being valued based on the dividends they paid. Our real estate wasn't being valued based on the rents it threw off. So we had no real income on the assets to service the debts. The only way we can service the debts is if we could sell the assets. But the minute we try to sell the assets, the price implodes. And the problem with the debt is the debt doesn't go away. When the asset prices go down, the debt doesn't go down. The debt's still there until we default on it. Meanwhile, the debt has to be serviced. We have to pay interest in our debt. We're not getting income on the assets, but we have to pay our creditors interest on the debt. And the problem was, and I certainly saw that when I was writing the book, that a lot of the debt was floating rate. A lot of the mortgage debt had teaser rates, where initially for the first few years you get a low payment. But then what happens after the teaser rate expires? You have to make much higher payments. So we were judging the manageability of the debt based on the teaser rates. We weren't factoring in what happens. I mean, everybody knows a lot of times you can subscribe to cable television and they'll give you, 3 months free. But obviously at some point, the real rate kicks in. Well, we were trying to base our ability to handle our debts based on the fact that we can afford the teaser rates. So I knew that there was going to be a major collapse coming. But what's really happened is the bubble has been pricked. We simply found a pin that I knew was out there, and I described the pin as the bursting of the housing bubble. I thought that was the most likely event that would set the events in motion for the economic collapse, because that would expose the fallacy of the economy. But the real crash and the economic collapse that I envisioned was going to be how the government was going to respond to the developing crisis. What my fear was is that the bubble would burst, the real estate market would burst, debts would be exposed, banks would fail, lenders would go broke, the economy would go into a severe recession, a lot of Americans would lose their jobs. The fact is, a lot of jobs were the direct result of the excess spending that went along with the real estate boom. When Americans had home equity, they felt rich, and so they went out and they bought stuff. And when Americans were using their teaser rates, they took the difference between what the rate would normally be and their subsidized rate, and they went out and spent the money. And, of course, a lot of Americans were able to extract home equity, and they were able to spend that money. So you had a phony economy based on everybody spending money they really didn't have. And I knew that when the spending stopped, the economy would contract, and all the jobs that were associated with that, all the cars that we bought that we couldn't afford, and the houses that we were remodeling, and all the credit cards, all these jobs would have to go away because they really weren't viable to begin with. So I thought this process would begin. Now, what we have to understand is the recession, right, this unwinding of this credit bubble, is the cure, right? The disease was the fact that we were borrowing and spending all the money in the first place. That was the problem. This is the solution. It's painful. It's not fun when you have to correct the imbalances. Coming off of a hangover, if you're all drunk and now you're hungover, that process isn't fun. But that's what happens when you're going to get normal. And we were all drugged up on cheap credit. We did a lot of crazy things, right? George Bush pointed out that Wall Street got drunk, and yeah, they were drunk. Main Street was drunk. The whole country was drunk. But they were drunk on the cheap money supplied by the Fed. I mean, the Fed was the bartender. The Fed liquored everybody up. And so we did a lot of stupid things. Wall Street did a lot of things that they never would have done if they were sober. Same thing with Main Street. The government came in and made risk-taking riskless. They took the risk out of risk-taking. It was just profits. The money was cheap. It was easy to speculate. They were one-way bets. And if your bets went wrong, don't worry. The Fed had your back. Greenspan put, too big to fail, all sorts of moral hazards. Don't lend money to people to buy houses. Doesn't matter if they can't pay. Fannie and Freddie are guaranteeing the debt. They're backed by the government. Don't worry. So we had the bubble, and it's burst. But what I predicted, that the real economic crisis would be because of what the government was going to do to reflate the bubble. And this is where I see the lion's share of the problems, and they're still in our future. And in fact, the government is even surprising me with what it's able to do. When I first wrote this book, and I was trying to think of all the ways the government would try to artificially stimulate the economy, I couldn't even come up with all the stuff that they've actually done. They've actually surprised me by what they've done. And therefore, I think the collapse could be even worse. I mean, when I wrote the book, hyperinflation was kind of the worst-case scenario. I didn't think it was the most likely scenario. I thought it was a possibility. I thought it was remote, but I thought there was a good chance of it, and I wrote about it. Now I think that hyperinflation might be the most likely scenario. It doesn't mean it's 100% guaranteed, but it's likely. Because the problem is, and the way I wrote in the book, so we'd have this bubble economy, it would burst, and then the government would try to blow it back up. The government would try to put air back into the bubble. Because that's the way we always have reacted in the past. That's the way Greenspan ran the Fed. Every time the economy started to contract, they intervened. They increased money supply. They slashed interest rates. They stimulated the economy. And so we never really got a full recession. We never really got to correct the imbalances of the boom because we simply piled on more imbalances, and we kept sweeping the problems under the rug or kicking the can down the road. But I saw that this latest bubble that the Fed had created was going to be so huge and so enormous that there was no way to